All right, so good morning. Thank you for being here on a Friday morning and sharing your thoughts and a discussion on internet governance and related topics this morning. My name is Marietje Schaake. I'm a member of the European Parliament for D66. It's a Dutch progressive liberal political party. And I was elected to the European Parliament in 2009 and have since been working on roughly three main subjects. I'm a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Committee on International Trade, and the committee that deals with culture, media, education, youth and sports. And within that framework, I focus mostly on Europe's digital agenda. And I was asked to focus mostly on internet governance, but for me, the line between sort of technical internet governance and issues relating to internet jurisdiction, international relations, international trade, human rights, development are sort of at the core of my political work. So I think it could be interesting for this morning as well to also look at some current affairs issues that relate to the role that technologies play in our daily lives, that internet plays in the daily lives of people, and to not just make this a technical discussion about sort of meetings of the ITU or the IGF, etc. But I will definitely talk about that. And I think we find ourselves at a particularly interesting week when it comes to the role that internet plays in our lives. I'm sure you've all heard about the discussion about whether YouTube has made the right decisions to take offline in certain countries the video called Innocence of Muslims, the requests to do so from the White House in the United States, and the subsequent discussion. So I don't know if any of you have a thought about this. What did you think when you read this? Or when you saw this? Anyone? All right, so we'll take some time for you to warm up, that's okay. But trust me, you will have to participate in this discussion. I'm not going to be talking for an hour and a half all by myself. I think it's a very interesting example, one of many, where you see that the hyperconnectivity that we find online can create a tension with sort of the local and nation-state-based level of laws and jurisdictions. And it also reminds us of the power that international companies, internet companies such as Google, of which YouTube is a part, have in today's world, the impact that they can have, and also the influence and the opportunities of sharing information, accessing information across borders beyond the limits or the confines of a nation state. Information spreads at the speed of light, at the click of a mouse, and the consequences can be unforeseen. And I think that this is a really challenging but also a fascinating subject. A little bit on internet governance itself. I'll focus on the history, some of the technicalities. Then I'll highlight some of the discussions that are taking place around certain topic areas, such as intellectual property rights enforcement online. And then I'll come back to some agenda items for upcoming internet governance meetings, such as of the International Telecoms Union and the Internet Governance Forum of the United Nations. If some of you feel that I'm talking about something that you don't understand or you want clarification of a definition or a word, please raise your hand. I don't want to be talking in my own terminology or bubble, but I really want to make sure that we get out of this morning what can be relevant for you and for your education here at the Free University. When we look at the technical discussions about internet governance, these can be roughly divided into two categories. On the one hand, there is the real technical sort of infrastructural aspect of what is necessary to keep the internet working. And the other part of it, which is what I'll focus on today, is the policy discussion. The governance of the internet, who gets to make which decisions, who are the stakeholders at the table, and what is going on. Briefly on the technical side, this, as well as the policy discussion, has organically developed alongside the development of internet. There was not one sort of top-down design of how to to build the internet. As you know, it has just evolved into a very, very complex network of different players to what it has become today. And the same actually goes for the evolution of the technical side of internet governance. It is mostly handled by non-profit, membership-based independent standard-making bodies, such as the Internet Engineering Task Force and the World Wide Web Consortium. There's also the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, which is a private-led entity, and it takes care of sort of operational aspects of the Internet. And it's sometimes a bit controversial, but we can come back to that, especially in its responsibility for the domain name system, the allocation of addresses online and the operation of the DNS root server system. Now, the policy discussions are even more recent than the technical developments. It has really sparked in the past 10 years, roughly. So far, internet governance relies on the so-called multi-stakeholder approach, which means that it's not just in the hands of governments, not just in the hands of business or corporate players, not just in the hands of consumers or internet users, not just in the hands of civil society, but that it's a joint effort to make sure that decisions about the internet are balanced in terms of all those who are impacted by the decisions. This is important because there are some areas where a traditional regulatory framework such as competition law or other kinds of oversight can't really deal with the complexities of the internet. And we see, whether we like it or not, that the power of internet is differently distributed, as I alerted to, or hinted to in the example of YouTube and the innocence of Muslims. Power and influence are redistributed in a very different way than the traditional territory of the nation state. So again, it's not just conventional decision makers, and this is very interesting also in terms of oversight, the democratic character or the lack of democratic character of these kinds of bodies, the inclusiveness and the way in which it is shaped. Then there are several meetings or events that gradually played a role in the development of the policy discussions about internet governance. In 2003, there was the World Summit of Information Society in Geneva and another one in Tunis in 2005. And at these meetings, governments, businesses, civil society, academics, representations from all over the world gathered to discuss the internet, what was happening in their context, in their societies, and how to take steps forwards. At these WSIS meetings, there was a multi-stakeholder working group for internet governance that was set up by the UN Secretary General to investigate and make proposals for action as appropriate on the governance of internet. And the key achievement of this working group was to develop a broad and inclusive understanding of internet governance to be incorporated in the final Tunis agenda, which was signed on to by 174 governments. So that's quite broad. And the definition of internet governance that came out of this Tunis agenda is, quote, the development and application by governments, the private sector and civil society in their respective roles of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures and programs that shape the evolution of the internet. So far it's all pretty straightforward. The definition talks about stakeholders and challenges for internet governance, but it doesn't necessarily provide a direction or a goal or a framework for jurisdiction or the way in which it has to develop. So that is all still being discussed as we speak, and that is mostly taking place in several platforms where internet governance should be discussed. Good morning. The IGF, the Internet Governance Forum of the United Nations, is such a multi-stakeholder body, and it has met 6 times so far, and we are now preparing for the next meeting in Baku, which will take place in November, and I'll be participating in several workshops there. the European Parliament also sends delegations to each of these sessions and has passed resolutions to shape the thinking in the European Parliament and to address the European Commission on how it should deal with the EU's positioning in the global internet governance framework. The UN Secretary General was tasked with starting the process of enhanced cooperation, and this should focus on enabling governments on equal footing to carry out their roles and responsibilities in international policy issues pertaining to the internet, but not to the day-to-day technical and operational matters that do not impact international public policy issues. So there is a real attempt to distinguish these two. But the IGF is certainly not the only body where internet governance or decisions about the internet are made. I mentioned the International Telecoms Union, but there's also the World Intellectual Property Rights Organization, the World Trade Organization, the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation, the Council of Europe, the Organization of American States, UNESCO, the UN Human Rights Council, the G8, and the European Parliament. There are many platforms where several decisions, different decisions are made that have a big impact on internet users and the rules and regulations around it. And of course, and this can sometimes be a challenge, national governments make their own laws in the meantime. So the web of decision-making, of influencing and of responsibilities that we now consider internet governance is actually almost as complex as the internet itself. On the one hand, there is praise for the multi-stakeholder system, but there's also imperfections, and there's a number of complaints versus the organizations, for example, the IGF. Civil society from developing countries and developing countries themselves believe that they're oftentimes or underrepresented. They believe that small businesses, minority groups, younger people do not have an equal say in these platforms, and that big companies, powerful governments have everything to say. There can also be barriers to full participation because of the expenses, the costs, but also the expertise required or language requirements, for example. And I think it is absolutely important that these multi-stakeholder models are as inclusive as they can be. But there's also concerns about the capability of this system to develop. Yeah? May I ask a question about this internet governance? Well, I think civil society is very important, and it plays an active role in a lot of these platforms. For example, the Council of Europe is also very much in touch with civil society, and we are too in the European Parliament. And civil society can help shape the agenda in the nations where they are active, and then try to influence the government participation in these fora. But the real question, of course, is how binding decisions are at all when it comes to internet governance and how effective they are. And those concerns are shared by civil society, but also by governments, by businesses, by internet users, because there can be well-intended standards, for example, on the openness and the accessibility of internet. But when the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran decides that it wants to create a halal internet, which is now fully being rolled out, and which effectively means that Iranian people will only have access to a sort of intranet, a subset of websites and information that is highly censored, highly centralized, entirely monitored, then I don't know, with what value internet governance agreements can challenge these decisions. And so what I try to sketch is the different players and the complexity that we're facing, where the beauty of it is, on the one hand, that in a relatively unregulated manner, organically there has been sort of balancing out of interests. And that's also because not only the internet is interlinked and interrelated, but also the interests of stakeholders, companies and their users, is in a constant, let's say, dance for the right kind of influence. But I'll come back to some examples. For example, I'll I'll talk about the protests against the Stop Online Piracy Act and the Protect Intellectual Property Rights Act, and I'll talk about ACTA, where you can clearly see that governments or lawmakers in one country may think that there's a great solution for fighting online piracy, but where internet users and even companies and organizations and civil society all join together to say this is something that we don't believe in. And so I think on a pragmatic level, it's actually remarkable how much power civil society has and how much influence they have. And I also believe in a more general way that the internet has allowed well-organized minorities to really shape the agenda. And I think that that's an empowering aspect that internet and technologies can have, which is very interesting and which has been found and used by a number of civil society organizations, ranging from animal rights lobby to political parties that are normally in a minority position, to other kinds of issues, not only internet-related lobbying or internet-related decision-making, but really in the context of the public platform that internet is, besides a marketplace for a lot of people. So hopefully we'll come back to that. And I think that is, inclusion is of course one of the main challenges. All right, so to come back to what we were discussing, several organizations, some people are happy about the multi-stakeholder model. Others believe that it may be exclusive, that there may not be equality of influence between developed and developing countries, between powerful corporate players and internet users, and that there can be a conflict with national governments that are making laws. I mentioned Iran as an example, but we also know the example of China, where mass censorship is really changing the reality of the use of internet, is also forming a barrier to market entry for other companies to operate there if they do not want to participate in mass censorship. So it's constantly moving dynamic. And in our own societies, in democracies, in the European Union, in the United States, there's also a number of proposals, for example, when it comes to fighting cybercrime, when it comes to protecting intellectual property rights online, or protecting children, which can have a real impact on the way the internet is configured technically, but also in, for example, the credibility of the European Union or European countries when they're trying to prevent countries like China to censor or block information, while there may be cases in which they would like to block websites or censor information themselves. Roughly speaking, there is a growing tension between the technically borderless and the hyper-connected reality that we find online and this international legal system that is still based on geographical and national jurisdictions for the most part. So I'll talk about a few legal principles. Maybe this has also crossed your desks here in class, but then it's just to recap. The governing principle of territoriality and jurisdiction is that the state cannot take measures on the territory of another state by means of enforcement of national laws without the consent of the other. So sometimes there are agreements or treaties about this, but without those treaties in principle, this governing principle of territoriality confines decision-making to the jurisdiction of nation states. There are some exceptions, for example, the so-called universality principle, that jurisdiction is established based on the need to suppress some types of crimes, for example, internationally recognized. And this is applied in criminal law or revolves around damages in civil law. And there's another principle called the effects principle that provides for the jurisdiction based just upon the effects of acts of foreign companies committed abroad. So, for example, antitrust legislation or environmental law that also applies to companies operating in third countries. But at this moment, the internet is creating a whole different reality in this realm. And given the particular power that the United States has through its laws, because the most internet services, internet companies are based in the United States, are presenting all kinds of new challenges about these so-called extraterritorial measures. So extraterritorial measures mean that laws of one country actually have an influence on people in other countries. And with internet users, I'm sure you've all been in a situation where you wanted to open a new account to social media, to email or otherwise, where you were asked to click to accept the terms of use, and with that you've pretty much accepted that the US has jurisdiction over you for the terms of service of that online platform or service. And we've seen the examples of this even in the Netherlands, where in the context of the investigation of WikiLeaks, the US Department of Justice asked for the private Twitter messages and information of some Twitter users, including Rob Gongrijp. Maybe you've heard about this case. And Twitter decided that it would warn the users for which the US Department of Justice had asked for this information, so that these people were at least aware. But even though it tried, it was unable to stop this kind of intervention. And what this also shows is that it's very difficult for governments here, like the Dutch government in this case, to prevent this kind of request or subpoena for information. So it will probably create more and more cases where this challenge is becoming more evident. We've also seen the recent mega upload case. How many of you have followed that? I don't know if you... Okay, so mega upload was an online platform to store information. And it was not based in the United States. It was not ran by American citizens, but there was a case brought before an American court that alleged that most information stored via mega upload was actually pirated material. So illegally downloaded video, music, etc. And as a consequence, people were arrested across the world, in New Zealand, in Europe, etc. And the trial is still ongoing, but the business is effectively destroyed. And there are real questions there about sort of fair trial, but also innocent until proven guilty, because maybe you put your holiday pictures on there, or a family video to send to your grandmother on the other side of the world, and all that information is now sort of frozen because of this pending investigation. And I'm not saying that the people who were running mega upload are good guys or bad guys, but it's not up to me to say that. It's up to a judge to say that. And the interesting and new dynamic of this is that it's a judge, will be a judge ruling in the United States about citizens that are not based there, because it is a .com website that's possible. So it's a whole new world out there, and I look forward to discussing with you further. I think it is fascinating. And we don't only see this in copyright enforcement, but also with issues related to freedom of expression, for example. Also seen, again, coming back to the example of the innocence of Muslims, but also around issues of data protection. And with the growth of cloud computing and its significance, the Patriot Act, which is an American counterterrorism legislation, will apply to all data in the cloud. And so, again, we will see a lot of challenges of identifying where data is stored, which laws apply, and how to safeguard, on the one hand, fundamental freedoms of internet users, on the other hand, for governments to take their responsibility in taking care of the fundamental rights of their own citizens in the context of this hyper-connected world. And this is not technically internet governance, but I think these are very important decisions that relate to the use of internet. And not only policymakers or parliamentarians are dealing with this, not only people that are working in law enforcement, but civil society had also noticed the potential extraterritorial impact of proposed laws specifically initially in the field of intellectual property rights enforcement. As you may know, there's pretty much a fight going on between Hollywood and Silicon Valley, which is a short summary of where things stand. The big movie and music companies, record labels, film makers and distributors, and internet companies. And in these two specific proposals, SOPA and PIPA, for the sake of being short, the proposal was that US law should have even further reaching capabilities of bringing people before courts. And a massive movement erupted, massive movement developed, including the involvement of Wikipedia, which said if we start going down this avenue, that will be the end of the internet. And to symbolize this dramatic impact, they turned off, or they put their website on black for one day. Did you all, see this? Okay. And not long after, the now infamous ACTA demonstrations erupted all over the world. And ACTA was a proposal to fight the trade in counterfeit goods. So, for example, jeans that look a lot like a famous brand but that are not exactly made by those factories, handbags that look a lot like, let's say, Louis Vuitton, but they are not that, and many other products. And besides tangible products, the fight against piracy was also swept in the negotiations of this trade agreement. And the same fears around threats to internet freedom, digital freedoms that were expressed vis-à-vis SOPA and PIPA also emerged in the discussions around ACTA. And the United States was also a party in the negotiations of ACTA, but there the House of Representatives, the Parliament in the United States, did not have a decisive vote. And so it was more difficult for citizens to lobby their representatives. And so, as a member of Parliament, I ended up receiving a lot of people from the United States, or emails from all over the world, of people who wanted us, as parliamentarians in Europe, to vote against ACTA, because they realized, ranging from the US to Brazil, Mexico, Australia, and many, many places across the world, that what we would decide would impact their lives. And eventually, possibly with the help of your protests, we were able to get a majority in the parliament to vote ACTA down. So I think that's a pretty solid expression of civil society joined with businesses and internet users, consumer rights organizations against legislation that they risked would have a major impact on their lives. And of course, these kind of ad hoc protests are not the full solution. I think, generally speaking, for Europe's digital single market to flourish, we need intellectual property rights reform. Intellectual property rights, especially copyright, is in increased tension with the reality of information societies, the reality of the online environment. And it's very important to look at what role governments should play, whether they should be in a position to defend certain business models, or whether some developments, even if some businesses will not be able to make it, should just be left up to the market. And I think at this point there is a case to be made that the way in which intellectual property rights is currently managed and protected is actually disturbing the free market. So I believe that we will see much more of these kinds of global mobilizations and collaborations between people from all over the world to try to influence legislation in countries where they don't live. We will also see more attempts by governments to secure their power and control over their people in the online environment, especially when it comes to freedom of expression. There are a lot of countries where this is a serious problem, and I think it was elevated to the political agenda in the context of the uprisings in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Iran, and now also in Syria, where Syria, for example, currently even deploys an electronic army that is using internet and the way in which citizens use internet to trace them, to track them down, to find information about them, the networks in which they are active, as potentially critical of government, to then find these people and to prosecute them. I've talked to a number of activists that are telling about being confronted with entire printouts of their email and mobile communications while they were in prison and while they're being interrogated. And this makes it much more difficult to, let's say, deny or to try to withhold information about other people to protect their safety. And then, besides matters of life and death, of course, there are a lot of issues around free expression, where the internet is increasingly looped in as a tool for monitoring, surveying, censoring and controlling flows of information and what people do with it.
Do you know what the electronic army uses? What kind of tools?
Yes, we do know that. And no, it's actually quite well known. It was investigated by journalists mostly that were able to tie the experiences of some human rights defenders and trace it entirely back to the technologies that were used. And sadly speaking, a lot of these very repressive technological systems are developed and exported from the EU. And I think that that is something that needs to end. And so with a lot of political pressure, we were able in the EU to get sanctions passed on the export of technologies that can be used for repression, censoring and human rights violations, surveillance, etc. On an ad hoc basis. So there are now EU sanctions in place when it comes to the export of technological systems to Iran and Syria. And some members of this electronic army in Syria are also specifically identified as persons against whom restrictive measures apply. But there are more fundamental problems when it comes to ensuring transparency and accountability on the part of companies. So at this point, the EU doesn't have a clear sense of which companies are trading which kind of technologies all over the world. And there are some control mechanisms to the implementation of sanctions, such as the ones in Syria and Iran, but they are still performed by the member states. So the countries in which the company is based have to make sure that their companies comply with EU sanctions. And the problem there is that sometimes the role that these companies play, telecom companies or internet or other technological companies, are so important for the economy of that country that it's hard to imagine how, let's say, a Ministry of Economic Affairs 1 week takes its nation's pride in companies to a trade fair in China and the next week would have to report against them on behavior that may not be allowed. So the conflict of interest, I believe, is too risky. And there's also a technical barrier. On the one hand, you need highly qualified experts to understand the workings and the intrinsic, details of these technologies. On the other hand, you need to pair the technological knowledge with the context in which they're going to be used. So, on the one hand, in Europe, we do know a general category of technologies that is called dual-use technologies, which means as much as technologies can be used for good or neutral purposes, but the same technologies can also be used for repressive purposes. And this term was first used in the context of nuclear technology. So technologies that were used in nuclear installations. And you can imagine that, a water pump that is equipped with some technologies can be used for filtering drinking water or in some kind of factory, but also in a nuclear facility. And so there are measures to have some extra controls on these dual-use technologies, but we still have to push for more inclusion of also human rights analysis, so not just in the context of nuclear science, but also in the context of repression. And I think it is important that we identify another category, which I like to call single-use technologies, because some of these systems are unequivocally designed to perform mass censorship, mass surveillance, or to identify an individual out of a pile of information based on words that this person uses, and especially when used in countries where, on an official level, the EU has condemned human rights violations, has condemned the absence of the rule of law. We have to be more efficient in making sure that these systems are not simply slipping below the radar and falling into the hands of governments that are our adversaries, actually. And so I'm working on tweaking the legislation and making sure it gets updated. There are some companies active in this field that we know. For example, Nokia Siemens Networks was called out after providing for monitoring services on top of the telecoms network in Iran in 2008. It later sold this monitoring capacity, which has raised all kinds of interesting questions, whether that's a solution. If you believe that a service can be used to violate people's human rights, do you terminate it, or do you simply sell it so that it's no longer yours, but it still continues? And Nokia has had a lot of problems, because you and I know what Nokia is. Maybe you have a Nokia phone, and this can lead to reputation damage. But there are also companies that do not have consumer goods or consumer technologies, that simply develop systems that are sold to governments, law enforcement agencies, police, state-owned companies. And the challenge is that we have technological requirements, such as lawful intercept capabilities, which in the Netherlands or in any European country technically enable, for example, the police to tap a mobile phone. And that's a requirement in the production in Europe. But when you imagine the use of these technologies in a country where the rule of law is absent, it is very easy to permanently open this technological backdoor and to, well, listen in or otherwise use signals and flows of information going through the phone to track people. I mean, in Iran we know, for example, that the GPS signal was also used to see whether there were 10 or more people on a street corner. And then police would simply go there to make sure that it didn't develop into a demonstration. So there's lots of ways in which technologies can be used in various contexts. This is not always easy to determine, but I think it's much more effective and efficient to do this on the EU level, so that 27 different member states don't have to figure this all out themselves. Besides, we are operating as a single market and as a trading bloc in the EU, so it only makes sense to have one European level assessment of this, I think. Do you guys need a break, or do you want to continue the discussion, or how are you all feeling? Because I have to leave around 11:15, so that's in 45 minutes. So maybe it makes sense to take a little break now. I see some people that could use some coffee, let me put it diplomatically, and then we can continue the discussion. Does that work? Okay. During the break, some of the questions already started, so I think that that's very good. I hope you all have a number of questions. And I also understood that there was an interest to talk a little bit more about the report that I'm about to finish in the European Parliament, that is working on shaping the first EU strategy on digital freedom in the context of the EU's external and security policies. And part of what I'm doing there has already come up because I want to make sure that the EU has a coordinated strategy vis-à-vis internet governance. I want to work on curbing this digital arms trade, but I also want to look at how the EU can help foster and enable human rights with the help of technologies and the use of internet, look at development policies and trade. So feel free to also ask me about that. All of the information, the report itself, a discussion paper I wrote to get crowdsourced information that fed into the formal parliamentary piece, and a lot of other work can also be found on my website. So you can feel free to browse through there if you feel like reading a little bit more after this class. But perhaps I can also reflect on it a little bit in this discussion. I'm going to leave in approximately, going to have to leave for a radio program in approximately 40 minutes, 35 minutes. So just to give you an idea. So who wants to ask a question? And I heard maybe some people have problems hearing me, but because I talk a lot to groups, etc., I can't really talk that much louder. So if you need to hear me more, please come forward. I think that that's the best solution, if you don't mind. There's a lot of space here, and as you can already tell, my voice is not really, you know, I can't really speak that much louder. So please feel free to come forward if you can't hear me. If you can, great. Don't be shy. Or we can all go home, that's fine too. Is that better? Yeah.
I was wondering if at the European Parliament you also discuss how the use of internet is how do you say, affecting the unconsciousness of people, because I think that the majority of things are being consumed by people in their unconsciousness. So therefore I think that big companies like YouTube and Google have a certain power without people really knowing it. Mm-hmm. Is that being discussed during...
Well, the unconsciousness of people is probably more a subject for scientists, for example, and so research into the impact of how search results play out or how advertising plays out online is researched and does feed into all kinds of decisions that we're making about the need to regulate or not to regulate, etc. So we're looking at it, but we are not sort of, you know, psychologists or scientists that can actually ourselves look at the impact on the subconscious. But awareness of the impact on society of new technologies is clearly something that I'm also feeding into my work, because I think that that's very important.
You said earlier that you signed against ACTA. What kind of things or people made you do that, or were you principally against it?
My political party, D66, and I myself have been against ACTA from the beginning. We looked at it in great detail, and I think that's the difference with a lot of other people. And the more I learned about ACTA, the more I thought it was a really misguided attempt. There are a lot of legitimate questions that were asked in the context of ACTA. For example, how to stop the trade in counterfeit medicine, which is clearly potential damage for society and something that we really have to work on. On the other hand, there are already treaties, the Council of Europe, for example, has one that deals with curbing the trade in counterfeit medicine. And we learned that in the process of the development of ACTA, it had become such a broad piece of legislation which included a variety of issues, ranging from identifying the country of origin of certain products, so whether Parma ham is indeed from Parma, or whether champagne is actually made in the Champagne region in France, to the limiting or enforcement of intellectual property rights in trade, so banning the trade in counterfeit jeans, bags, medicine, electronics, etc., to fighting online piracy. And I believe that copyright enforcement and management in the EU is currently dysfunctional, and it's very fragmented. So every country, 27 different countries, have their own rules, their own management mechanism. And what this means for companies and small and medium-sized enterprises is that it's very difficult to roll out an online service or any kind of service that relates to music or video or film, for example, in 27 countries all at once. Because you need to hire lawyers with expertise of the specific country, with language skills of the specific country, to make sure that the rights are cleared each and every time. Maybe you've heard of Spotify. It's an online streaming music platform, which is actually owned and created by the record industry. And it has not been possible to simply, so even if the person who, or the entity, the company that wants to roll out this service is very close to the rights holders, it's impossible to at once roll it out in Europe. And we claim to be a single market. We strive and aspire to be a single market, but there's still a lot of barriers, especially in the digital single market. And I believe that the reform and harmonization of copyright in Europe is so important that any legislation, including ACTA, that would solidify the existing system would actually be a problem. So for various reasons, but specifically for this reason, and for the risk of hampering internet freedom, we had grave concerns about ACTA from the very beginning. And it was helpful that the voices against ACTA became louder and more diverse, so that we could include more parliamentarians in the process of looking closely at ACTA. And the more they learned, the more critical they became.
Okay, thank you. I just have a question about, you've mentioned sort of the U.S. being able to, U.S. law having jurisdiction over a lot of stuff that has to do with data protection across the world based on like their different acts, including the Patriot Act. And I'm wondering, in the EU, how do you see the EU coping with that in terms of like its own sovereignty and its own ability to govern its own companies and people and stuff like that? Mm-hmm. How do you see that progressing, and how would those two mesh together?
Well, there's a few aspects. I think on the one hand, this is simply a political discussion that needs to be had, because it's not only an issue of the online environment, but for example, in the case of Iran sanctions, which is not necessarily related to the internet at all, the US also reaches into Europe to a great extent with the way in which the US-Iran sanctions are organized. And the EU has its own sanctions, and we make different decisions. And we do that because we believe it better serves our interests, and it better serves the Iranian people. And we want to have a much clearer distinction than the US between how we address the Iranian regime and those in power and the Iranian people. And I think in all these cases, on the highest political level, the EU needs to address this issue with Americans. Because in my experience, I'm also a member of the US delegation of the European Parliament. When I address this to lawmakers, members of the House of Representatives, there are many of them that don't realize how impactful American law can be, you know, in Europe, for example. I think there's others who know very well and who don't mind. But I think we need to raise this and protest against this on a political level, and that's not happening sufficiently right now. On the other hand, we need to have stronger laws to protect our own citizens. And there's now a lot of work being done also by my colleague, Sophie in 't Veld, on data retention and privacy laws in the EU to try to better protect EU citizens also against these kinds of influences. Then, thirdly, I think education is really important. I think it's important that people know what they sign up for when they click OK to get started with these services. And fourthly, I think if we're able to take away the barriers in the single digital market, and if we invest in more technological development and engineering and R&D in the EU, we need competing services. And it may well be that consumers eventually vote with their feet. It could well be that American citizens eventually believe that the increased protection of their privacy or their rights when they use European services is more attractive than using American-based services. I think this is still in full development, and I think the market, so to say, will also solve part of it, that people will start to rethink the benefits of free online services at the expense of individual freedoms.
Sorry, just a follow-up question. So how would you, when you sign up for a service online, you always have a contractual agreement where you click I agree.
Mm-hmm.
So how would the EU override such contractual agreements?
Well, there's a lot of talk now before more cloud computing gets introduced of how to deal with this. And that's still a discussion that is in full swing. So to some extent, there is an attempt to get agreements with the US that, there is still a virtual territory when entering the EU. There are some ways in which American companies have to adhere to EU law when they're dealing with EU customers. But again, it's also up to people to make their own decisions, but they can only make the right decisions if they have the information that's needed. And terms of services of a lot of online companies can change without notification. So if you said yes once, then you're sort of in. So I think there is a lot of education that needs to happen, and in various policies, whether it's about cloud computing, whether it is about digital freedom or internet governance even. These are issues that we can bring up. And I think the thinking about these impacts is also changing in the US.
I have a question about fighting piracy. What do you think is the real future of copyright protection on the internet? I mean, there are initiatives like Spotify. Do you think that is the future?
I think online models and new business models are the future. I think we have to be careful for the emergence of new monopolies. I think one of the great advantages of internet is that the individual is very much empowered. It's much easier to find and share information. It's not a traditional top-down process anymore where a few media companies can actually determine what the news is and what information gets shared and what doesn't. At the same time, there are some companies online that are acquiring so much power, and I think the same goes for the record industries and the film industries to some extent, that they are so powerful that it's nearly impossible for small, medium-sized businesses to compete, or that it's nearly impossible to make a choice, really, if you're an artist, where to go with your work, and it should diversify. A lot of that will happen in the marketplace. For a lot of it, government can't really do much. What I would like to see is that we reform in the EU and harmonize intellectual property rights management so that we are more adequately meeting the rapid developments of society. I mean, if we don't do anything, I think some solutions will be found. We see initiatives here in the Netherlands of the Consumer Rights Organization and the Labor Union for performing artists, performing musicians, that have actually joined forces a few years ago already and said, we don't want to criminalize our audiences, so we don't want to talk about illegal downloading anymore. It's not in our interest. And I thought that was a very bold and wonderful step that came from civil society, effectively. So there will be solutions that people will come up with themselves. There will also be alternatives that people will find if there's not sufficient innovation on the part of traditional industries. And the resistance to embracing the online environment has been that the business model of window releases or step-by-step releases has been so profitable that I believe there's been a misconception that by just blocking reform and by just focusing on enforcement, that would be the best solution. But if we look at France now, the country of Hadopi, the country of the 3 strikes law, right, where the plan was that if you are caught with illegal downloads 3 times, you could be denied internet access, is now being revised. It's completely ineffective, it's very, very expensive, and it's outdated. I mean, nobody downloads anymore. People stream now. And our laws are barely incorporating wording on downloading now. So it should also make us humble perhaps a little bit. If we look at the speed of decision making in a democracy compared to the technological developments. Let's look at what is necessary, create a frame, but don't tie it too much to one or another technology because it will be outdated before we know it. And I also think, that technologies offer huge opportunities for artists to reach more audiences and to make money in a very different way. Some of the contracts that they have with record industries are actually quite strangling.
What would a modern version of
What would a modern version of intellectual property rights look like? What revisions would there be in comparison to current intellectual property rights?
Yeah, well, it's more in the management and the enforcement. So there's, roughly speaking, sort of legal principles of intellectual property rights, but also principled aspects where, there's just ethical understanding that somebody who creates something can always have the right to claim that it is his or hers, regardless of how much money you can make with it, regardless of where it goes. Just perhaps you make a great invention, for example, or you write a wonderful text. You didn't really want to share it yet, but 30 years later, somebody finds it in your drawer, it becomes brilliant, and everybody thinks it's great. If the person that finds it then says, I wrote this, you may want to say, no, actually, I did. And that's a principled discussion, not so much, a financial one or a legal one. Because you can take care of that in different ways. I think more choice for artists and creators is very, very important, so that they can determine what they want to do with their work. There are people who make art, music, simply because they love it, and not because they dream of being a billionaire. And a lot of people dream of being a billionaire, but they wouldn't be one because their work is not successful enough, and it's not the fault of piracy, let's say. So I think we have to completely revise the thinking about this, and we have to enable easier access to culture. There's also a very public value in this. It's not only an economic model. There is a value of sharing information, access to knowledge, for example. So I think we should help the development of new business models that actually do justice to the right to claim creation, the right to get fair remuneration for artists and others, but that don't hamper the opportunities that the digital environment brings, and that also reevaluate the role that our current laws play. Are they relevant? Are they inclusive? Do they favor certain businesses over others? That's a real complaint often heard by internet companies, for example. So I think empowerment of the individual, again, to make their own choices, to determine what they want to do with their work, and opening the opportunities for easier sharing and easier access for people with possibly, smaller margins can be a real win. I mean, if it becomes less expensive to access, then perhaps people will start consuming more of it, and you can still have the same profits. I think the margins that are made by publishers, record companies now are very, very high. And they're sometimes artificially high. Also when you look at developing countries where if you look at the equivalent of the price of a CD or a DVD, it can sometimes be like 100 euros. If you look at the purchasing power. But the people who own the rights still want to keep the price at a certain level. And the question is why, and the question is whether that's justified.
But is it then also a question if there still should be a law that protects intellectual property?
Well, the principle of it to be able to attribute a work to a person, I think, is very legitimate. And I think if we don't reform the current way intellectual property rights are managed and enforced, and this is also something that a Dutch professor, Professor Hugenholz, has said, who has studied this extensively, we risk the loss of legitimacy for copyright at all. There are a lot of people now who believe that copyright serves no function whatsoever. And so in order to to maintain sort of the principles, which I do believe serve a purpose, we need to make sure that we have more adequate laws. But the lobbying against reform is very, very, very serious. Very serious. And it includes, you know, free concerts by very famous bands in the European Parliament, etc. Against reform.
By bands.
Well, by record companies, and then they have good contacts with bands, so they can, or with singers, or other famous artists. Huh?
Every night a concert?
Not every night, but every year at least. No, it's true. Andrea Bocelli, or what's it? No, who was it? Yeah, Andrea, what? No. And Beck performed recently, for example. Yeah, it's quite famous. Yeah, did it. Did it.
If there's no one else, could you take like the last 10 to 15 minutes to talk about your research?
Yes.
And to report, if you're allowed to, any of your
Yeah,
findings and how you did the research, because that'd
Yes,
be interesting.
I would be happy
Thank
to.
you.
Okay, so part of this will be a repetition of what I've mentioned, because parts of it have come up in our discussions. But since I started work in the European Parliament, I noticed that there is not adequate policies to deal with the revolutionary impact that technologies have, not only in our own societies, but also on foreign policies. And a lot of organizations are looking at this, and I thought the European Union was running behind. So whether it's NATO or the US State Department or governments of third countries, I felt that a lot of people were more aware of the opportunities that technologies offered them than we were in Europe. So I wanted to see if I could develop a strategy for the well, now called digital freedoms in the EU's foreign policy. And when I was appointed to do this sort of parliamentary report, I also wanted to make sure that the voices of all kinds of stakeholders and people were included. So I started by drafting a discussion document, a paper, that highlighted the tensions around human rights, where on the one hand it emphasized the enormous enabling potential that technologies have to have more freedom of speech, to access information, to freely assemble online, to have press freedom, or to document and share human rights violations, for example. And on the other hand, to look at the real threats that human rights defenders and dissidents and activists in various countries face, also because of the use of technology. In the meantime of drafting this report, I also made an amendment to the budget of the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, which freed up millions to work on the development of protecting human rights defenders in various ways. And also to mainstream the role of technologies in other human rights and democracy work that happens across the world. I made some proposals about how development could benefit from the new technologies. So the EU is still the biggest donor of development aid, and I think there's various ways in which we can build digital freedoms in the work that we do. Sometimes it's very practical. We have seen, or I've seen in Nigeria, but I know it's been used in many countries, citizen vote counting with an SMS system. So even in countries where the poverty level is very extensive, in a country where, like in Nigeria, 75 million people are eligible voters, a country where vote rigging and election fraud is very common, there have been systems developed where citizens can actually witness the vote count and with a code send a text message that feeds into a bigger system that is then kind of a parallel counting, which is a very good indicator of how severe the rigging could potentially be. And even though a lot of people don't have broadband or laptops, mobile phones are increasingly spread throughout even the poorest countries. So that's a pragmatic or very practical hands-on example, but on sort of a more systematic level, the EU sometimes also helps countries develop its infrastructure, including information infrastructure. Why not pair European regulators or pair conditions on how these systems can be used to ensure that the freedoms of people are more guaranteed? The EU has conditionalities built into a number of our programs. So in trade agreements, we ask for minimal guarantees in terms of environmental protection, child labor, human rights. I think this can also be extended to digital freedoms. And this applies to aid, for example, but it can also apply to trade, where I mentioned the importance of stopping this digital arms trade. That's one of the proposals that I'm also including in my digital freedom paper and report, but also to address the limitations to trade as a result of mass censorship. So not only the human rights impact, but also the effective market barrier that this poses for European companies, for example. I also highlighted the importance of internet governance and an EU strategy on this. There are some fora like the ITU where each EU member state has one vote. There are other fora like the IGF where there's a different configuration and where different stakeholders play a role. And there is more preparatory work being done on the EU level to make sure that delegations go prepared and that they know, what they want to get out of this. So from a variety of angles, I try to emphasize both the opportunities and the threats that we have to reconcile. And this is also to balance out another report that is now worked on in the European Parliament that deals mostly with the security and defense aspects. And there's a real tendency, similar to how there's a real tendency to focus on enforcement of intellectual property rights, to focus on the security and the threats to security and to cyber threats, cyber war, cyber crime, in my opinion, sometimes disproportionate way. If you look at the research that's being done, it's often done by companies that sell security software. So they clearly have an interest in making people feel like they need a lot of protective software because it's a great market. So we need more independent research, for example, on that. And we need to also make sure that we do not strangle the opportunities that new technologies offer by only focusing on the risks that they may also pose. I think in some of the discussions on cybersecurity, we see kind of a parallel development compared to the discussions around the war on terror, where it was very easily, where freedom was very easily swept off the table for alleged increases in security. And the real story is, of course, that 100% security does not exist, that making people wise and responsible in dealing with technologies is at least as important, and that some of the opportunities that new technologies bring actually also form a counterbalance to the security risks. So this balance is very important, and this report is heavier on the emphasis of freedom to balance out the security report. And I would invite you to read the discussion paper. I put it online for about 2 months, got a lot of input from governments, human rights organizations, digital freedom organizations, companies, academics. It was a very, very good experience. It really helped produce, I think, a better first draft, which I presented in the Foreign Affairs Committee yesterday, and on which I'm working now with colleagues from all different political groups who will provide the input on behalf of their political group. And beyond their role, every member of the European Parliament is free to submit amendments. And I'm sure there will be many, because it's now, especially with recent developments in North Africa, but also issues like WikiLeaks or this Innocence of Muslims film, people are beginning to understand that there's something that needs to be done. They don't always know what. And so I'm also trying to make this a collaborative process so that there's a lot of knowledge sharing. I've often invited experts to the Parliament for small working sessions to simply inform my colleagues, because I'm convinced, just as what I saw happening with ACTA or around ACTA, that sometimes the more people know, the more they will move in the direction that I also believe they should go in. And the less they know, the more vulnerable they are to lobbying, obviously. So this is sort of the process that I'm in right now. It's very exciting. And hopefully this will actually lead to a systematic and strategic approach on the foreign policy side, which will mean upgrades and different implementations of trade and export regulation, a more sophisticated application of technologies to make our human rights and democracy work more effective, to make our aid and development work more effective, and to have a good sense of where society is going under all these technological developments, and to make relevant policies and not just, run behind the ball by about 5 years. So it's ambitious, and it fits in the context of the other work that I'm doing. But it's been a wonderful process, and I think there is momentum gathering now. And there were also some people who asked, is it fun to work in the European Parliament? Do you like it? And I would like to recommend to you all to try to make a visit one time, because it's really fascinating to see how work around lawmaking, technologies, intellectual property rights management, digital freedoms, actually takes shape and is debated in the context of the European Parliament. We also have live streams of most of our committee meetings, so it's very easy to listen to it once. It can be quite boring, but it can also be quite exciting. And it simply gives you an idea of how the ins and outs of this European level decision making work. And I think that is an important part of every education, but especially if this is a field that particularly interests you. I think Europe is a level of decision making that has the future. If you're about to make decisions about your future education or jobs or internships, knowledge about the EU, practical experience in the form of an internship are, I think, not only interesting, but really I see the asset and the value of this in terms of, CV building, network building, increasing. And I know that you will not have you're graduating and entering the labor market at a moment where it's not necessarily easy. So it's important to look at how you can get the right qualifications. But if you're ever in Brussels, I hope you'll let me know. I'll be happy to see if I can meet you again or introduce you to some other colleagues, and I hope this session was helpful. I always enjoy talking to people all over the country, and especially students. So thank you for being here. And if you, again, want more information, just visit my website, follow me on Twitter, and we can stay in touch.